So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about fruit tree planting and management. It's just an introduction really to choosing your fruit trees, to planting and establishing them. So it's such a big topic, and I've tried to just do an intro to kind of each bit. You can go on from there because otherwise I'd be speaking for hours and hours. So I'm going to go through today, introduction into fruit trees. Mainly going to be speaking about apples today, but touching a little bit on cherries and plums and pears. Why you should plant fruit trees, when to plant them, some stockists and nurseries that we use, rootstocks, varieties, and which tree where. Sorry, how to plant them. So how to dig out your tree pit and what to do when you're actually physically planting the tree, a little bit about early care and a bit about ongoing care. So again, just a tiny bit about pruning, pests and diseases, and if you've got an under or unproductive fruit tree, and then a bit more further reading. So it's kind of back to basics. The apple is the fruit of the domestic apple tree, the Malus domestica. They're grown all over the world, and they come from a wild ancestor in Central Asia, the Malus silvesii, probably, which is there's a picture of it here. So it looks very similar to our kind of regular apple tree. And you can still find these today. More than 7,500 cultivars or varieties of apple, and 2,500 of these have been developed in the UK. This means that you could technically eat a different British apple variety every day for over 6 years, which is amazing, and a really great fact from this this group, the Orchard Project. I'll be putting a link into some of their stuff at the end. Varieties are divided into dessert, eating, and cooking. So that's just to do with how they kind of break down or keep their shape, or the sharpness of taste, their appearance, and stuff like that. They're bred for all sorts of traits as well. So you get all different varieties of apples that fit certain climates and things, and look a certain way, or have certain hardiness to different diseases, things like that. Interest in breeding apples began in the UK in Roman times. So there were big peaks, medieval times, as amateur gardens began to experiment. And unfortunately, you won't be able to find many of these varieties in the supermarkets. They're often limited to, I'm sure you'll have seen, Granny Smith and Golden Delicious and Braeburn, Gala, things like that. If you do have a look at some of these supplies online, they have all sorts of varieties. So that's kind of one of the benefits of growing your own trees, is that you do get something a bit different and something probably a bit tastier. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about northern apple cultivars. So we're here in Manchester, and there are specific varieties that have been bred in this area. In Victorian times, there were really big orchards around about Chorley and the southern fringes of Preston, and the fruits from there were taken to markets of these rapidly growing northern towns. Some varieties developed in this neck of the woods include the Keswick Codlin. So this was first found grown as a seedling in a rubbish heap on Gleaston Castle near Ulverston, apparently, in the 1790s. And this is a dual-purpose apple. The Ribson Pippin is the most famous variety from Yorkshire, and it's a strong-tasting aromatic apple, really popular in Victorian times. And it gets its name from Ribson Hall in Yorkshire, where it was first grown in the 18th century. So again, this is a dual purpose. And then another one here is the Golden Spire, which was first discovered in Lancashire in about 1850. And this is a culinary apple, so for cooking and juicing. So you can see they have this real rich history, different apple varieties. And certain people have traced back the lineages of specific apples, and then they'll take these different apples and they breed them together and make different apple. It's really complex, and there's loads of different variety out there for you to take a look at and kind of have a look through for your own gardens. Let's go through some other fruit tree varieties as well. Apples, they come from all different apple strains, but they're just generally an apple which is, they're defined as an apple which is the fruit itself is 2 inches or less in diameter. So they come in all sorts of different colours. You might have seen them before. They look great. They're mainly used as decorative trees because they have really attractive flowers and foliage. They can be yellow right through to dark reds, and they're great for wildlife and attracting pollinators to an orchard. So they're a really good additional tree to have to encourage pollination of your culinary or eating apple trees. So this is a conference pear. So the common or European pear is the species which most orchard pear cultivars are grown from in Europe, North America, Australia. Generally, they're not quite as hardy as apples. They are picked when the fruit matures, but before the fruit are ripe. So you tend to pick a pear and you let it mature, you let it ripen in storage. The most popular variety in the UK is the conference pear. Lots of other varieties, kind of French varieties, you might see them around, different shapes, slightly different colours. And on the bottom left here, we've got different types of plums. So plums, you can get plums, just your kind of classic plum here on the left. You get Victoria plums, which is the top right, and green gages or gauges. And also damsons. So they're all different types of stone fruit, but from the same genus, Prunus. So they're all really similar in composition, but they taste different. They're different shapes, sizes, flavors. Damsons are usually turned into jam, and plums and gauges can be used for eating or for cooking. There are two, here on the bottom right is a cherry. So there are two different types of cherry native to the UK. There's the wild cherry, which is sweet fruit, and the birds love those. And if you find any of them in the wild, you'll see that they just stripped of their fruit straight away. And then there's the rarer bird cherry or black cherry, which is darker, more sour fruit that you might also find out in the countryside. So commercial sweet cherries are from the Prunus avium, so the wild cherry. Like this one, the Stella cherry or sunburst, but you can also get hold of sour cherries for cooking, like the Morello cherry, which you may have heard of. So loads to look into, and loads more if you're thinking about growing different type of fruit and not just apples. Loads to get your teeth into out there, and that to experiment with. Plant fruit trees. Obviously, loads of different reasons. I mean, they're really tasty. Actually, the UK is one of the best places in the world for growing fruit trees because we have such a drawn-out season. So it maximizes the flavor. Yields tend to be smaller, and the trees are under less stress from the climate, which helps to concentrate the flavors of the fruit. Of course, it's local produce, so it reduces your food miles. You might have watched our presentation last week on food and climate. It's important to protect and enjoy this really wild variety of cultivars, so to really celebrate the diversity in variety of British apples is, it's a great thing to do, and it's protecting those from going extinct. And there's so many to choose from. It's great for wildlife, of course. You can eat and share. As John was saying, he ends up with loads and loads of fruit, so it's something that you can maybe barter with someone else and swap for some of their produce. And then juicing, I don't really think it's pretty tricky and pretty expensive to go and buy a load of apples from the shop to juice yourself. So to get that lovely fresh juice, really one of the only options is to grow your own, or to try and get some apples locally. I just want to go through a bit of kind of choosing your fruit tree now. We've spoken a bit about varieties, so some are more suited to northern counties in the UK, or northern areas. Some don't mind getting a bit wet and windy, but they may have a preference for different soil types. Most commercial fruit growing in the UK takes place in Kent, Worcestershire, Herefordshire, where the combination of the soil and sunlight makes growing fruit trees a viable option on a large scale. Most apple and plum varieties will grow well in the north of England. Pippin here, this link, they've put together a really handy zoning guide for the UK, which gives you an idea of what you can grow in your area. So I just wanted to kind of demystify the choosing of your fruit tree. So we use a lot of these online suppliers, and they're really great because they have this such a wide variety, and they have all these different notes about the characteristics of different fruit trees, growing, tasting, cooking, things like that. So when choosing your variety, you're going to find all these cultivar notes online. And for example, here we've got the Ribson Pippin. So this was this Yorkshire variety. So if we kind of take a look down here at the characteristics, this will be below. If you're clicking on one of the pages in a fruit tree catalogue, you'll find something like this, something similar to this somewhere on the page. So just to kind of run through this a little bit. So guys, I just wanted to mention first of all that this is a spur bearer. If you see here, fruit bearing, spur bearer, which means that the fruit grows on shoots or spurs, which grow evenly along the main branches, rather than alternatively a tip-bearing tree, which you may see as well, where the fruit just grows on the end of the tips of the branches produced from the previous year. So this has an impact on how long the fruit takes to grow. So it can take a couple of years with a spur-bearing tree, as they have to grow the spurs first to be able to then grow the fruit. It also means that the fruit in the tree is pretty dense and compact, so you can get a kind of smaller tree there. And it also has an effect on pruning. So I'll talk a little bit about pruning later, but if you've got a tip bearer, it's very easy to prune off all your lovely fruit buds and then not have any apples grow the next year. So you've just got to think a little bit about that. That's one of the characteristics you might want to bear in mind for when you're choosing your apple tree. So let's kind of point here. I'm going to talk about flowering group and fertility now. So a fruit tree will be labelled as self-fertile, not self-fertile, and in some cases partially self-fertile. Going on to this again, we can see that the Ribson Pippin is a not self-fertile. If a tree is self-fertile, it won't need a pollinating partner to share pollen and produce fruit. A not self-fertile tree will need another partner nearby so that pollinators are able to move from one to the other to initiate fruiting. And a partially self-fertile will produce better and bigger fruit with a pollinating partner nearby, but can cope without. So just another factor that you might want to consider. If you're in an urban environment, though, you won't need to think about it. You won't need to worry too much, because there's likely to be another apple tree or a crabapple tree nearby in a garden, a park, or a hedgerow. Pears, plums, and cherries are a bit less widely planted, so you can't assume there'll be others nearby. Or varieties which are not self-fertile and require pollination partner, the partner has to be a different variety of the same fruit species. So two trees of the same variety will not pollinate each other. If you're in an isolated area and only want to plant one tree, choose a self-fertile variety. Apples tend to need pollinating partners from what I've seen, whereas plums and pears are often self-fertile. One of the easiest and simplest ways to see if two varieties could pollinate each other is to check their pollination of flowering groups too. So we can see here that the flowering group is number 3, which might seem a little bit arbitrary, but what it applies to is the period that the tree flowers in. So if it depends on the website, it might be a kind of like a 1 to 5 situation, or an A to E, A to F or something. But 1 is the earliest and say 5 is the latest. So if you find 2 trees that you'd like to act as pollinating partners, this flowering group needs to overlap. So if this is a number 3, you can take a number either side. So it could be a 2, 3, or 4. And that means that those flowering times will coincide and that they can pollinate one another, the trees. It's basically how it works. Thing you might want to consider when you're choosing your fruit tree is whether it's bare root or it's pot grown. So we can see here, this is another kind of section of the page from the Ribs and Pippin, and this is on the Orange Pippin website. And you can see it seems very complicated. I know when I first started looking at fruit trees, there was a lot that I was kind of Googling, trying to find out about. And so bare root versus pot grown. Bare root means the trees have been lifted from the ground and the roots are bare. This can only be done in the dormant season, so these trees will only be available to purchase from November to March. But this is the season that you should really be planting your fruit trees in anyway, because they're dormant. They are going to be less likely to be damaged, and they will establish better as they get that kickstart in the spring. Bare root trees tend to be cheaper, and I would definitely recommend going for these options. Grown or container grown trees are produced by transplanting a 1-year-old tree into a container. The tree is grown for the whole of its second year in the container. So these are available to purchase and plant all year round. Kind of the most common you'll find in garden centres, they usually be this container grown tree. So the age of the tree, you can kind of see here, it says 1 year, 2 year, 2 year, 1 year. So it really is just the size of the tree, and whether or not you want to make that immediate kind of statement, or whether you're willing to wait. If you get the 1 year tree, they do tend to establish better. They get used to the surroundings, and they're a bit more, a bit hardier, you know. The younger the tree, the cheaper it is as well, and they're easier to train it into any shape you like. A 1 year fruit tree is called a maiden, and a 2 year tree will already have been trained to some extent, meaning certain branches have been removed to create different base shape for the tree. I'll show you this diagram to let you have it kind of get an idea of this. So these are all different types of different ways of training a fruit tree. So you might have seen phrases like bush, half standard, standard, espalier, cordon. So they're all shapes that trees can be trained to. Bush-shaped trees have lower limbs than standards and half standards, which have a longer trunk before the branches emerge. Espalier, cordon, and fan are trained to grow against a wall. They tend to be more expensive to buy as they require more work to produce. So it really just depends what your preference is and the space that you have. So if you've got space in a lawn, space in a pot in the middle of a yard or something like this, you can definitely pick a bush or a standard. A fanner and a espalier or a step over here, they, as I said, they can be grown against a wall, and often you find a lovely south-facing wall that will really fit this purpose. They take a little bit more looking after, and they're a little bit more advanced in terms of ongoing care, so you might want to take that into consideration. This is a great diagram on rootstocks. So I'm constantly kind of going back to this and looking again just to check my rootstock sizes. And you can see here that it's got all the different rootstocks. So a fruit tree rootstock is the root and the lower trunk of a related species, which a separate fruit tree is joined to by grafting. So you take this rootstock, which has all these desirable features which you would like to have in your tree. So it could be that it's vigorous, or that it's limited growth, it's hardy, or it has some kind of disease resistance. And it often leads to the fruit tree being stronger and quicker to establish. And then the kind of top of the tree you'll pick for the foliage, for the flowers, for the fruits. So the join between the fruit rootstock and the main fruit tree is also called the scion. So that's the branch of a desired kind of tree, a desired fruit that you will join to the rootstock. It's really easy to find this join when you buy a tree online, because it will appear as like a bulge a few inches from the bottom of the stem where the wood has grown together. When you do plant this, and I'll mention this later, you just have to make sure that that join, that graft, is above the ground. It's not buried. So if allowed to grow without a rootstock, many fruit trees have reached heights of at least 15 feet. So rootstock, it won't affect the size of the fruit itself, but it means that the fruit trees can be grown in all sorts of different settings, from pots on patios to gardens and in denser orchards. Often we would choose an apple with a rootstock of MM106. You can see here, so that's a moderate sized tree to plant in a lawn, maybe at school or in a community garden or in front of GP surgery we have done earlier this year. The more dwarfing the rootstock, often the less hardy it is. So if you can control the ultimate size of your tree by pruning as well, this should help to make sure you have a healthy and good sized tree. So you might want to pick, you might think that it's it's a great idea to pick maybe a dwarfing rootstock, but then you have to think about the tree in the long term, and actually that it will be a bit less hardy than something on a stronger, bigger rootstock. I'll send this presentation through, as I mentioned. That's a lot of information, I know, but all really useful, and you'll be able to go back through it as you begin to, or if you like to pick your own trees, and you kind of start to look through some of these catalogues and databases online. Let's mention a couple of nurseries that we use. We've found a couple of really good nurseries in the north of England, just in North Yorkshire. And these two here, Orange Pippin and RV Rogers, both have online catalogues. So there's loads of variety, and they'll also give you advice over the phone on what to grow where. They've been really helpful to us in the past. If we've given them a situation, or they'll even give you advice on what varieties to grow for kids, because they're lovely and bright and colourful and tasty and can be eaten straight off the tree. So really worth phoning these places up if you're a bit unsure about what to pick. It could also be, it's also really advantageous to pick a local nursery, as they understand the local climate better. The trees undergo less stress when they're being transported. They have less distance to be transported. They'll have been the first years of their life, have been grown in a similar climate to where they'll end up, so they're used to it. And you might be able to get hold of some really local varieties as well. You may have to shop around a bit though, as they've been really busy this year, with everyone spending more time in the gardens and getting into growing their own. So just if you are finding that a lot of the varieties and a lot of the different types, different rootstocks and things are sold out on their website, it's worth just giving them a call and saying, I'm looking for a certain tree on a certain rootstock. Do you have this? Is there something similar that you can recommend? They are really helpful in that situation. Okay, so we've talked about varieties. We've spoken about rootstocks and things, and demystifying that kind of process of buying online, or even you might find a tree in a local nursery, or in even a supermarket, or I went to B&Q the other day. I was looking at some of the labels on the fruit trees there. When you start to understand about rootstocks and training and things like that, you can really you can pick those trees that will fit best in your situation, and really understand what's going to happen in the life of the tree, I guess. So now we're going to talk about when to plant. So as I mentioned, it's best to plant in the winter months. Although planting in the summer is possible with the pot grown plants, it's best not to disturb the trees during this period, as it's when they are growing most vigorously, and they're less likely to establish well in the summer. And really you'll just need to keep watering them quite a lot just to get them going. So best to plant in the winter. Avoid planting also when the ground is waterlogged or frozen. Planting a tree is a long-term investment, so it's best to wait until the conditions are right. Well-packaged bare root trees will usually survive for up to 10 days, whilst unprotected ones will survive for 3 to 5 days. So bare root trees, if you can't plant them straight away because the weather conditions aren't right, you can either store them in maybe like a wrap up the roots, store them in a cold shed or garage, or you can heal them in the meantime. So you can heal any type of tree in. So you maybe not just fruit trees, but any kind of hedgerow trees or whatever, native trees that you get. So healing in means just to plant them in a way that the tree, they'll be easier then to pull up again. So it's basically about keeping the roots nice and damp, and leaving them in a place where they're not going to get damaged. So you lie the trees in the ground. You see this diagram here. It's quite useful. At around 90 degrees, the trench. So the roots at the bottom of the trench, and then refill. Cover the roots with soil. Firm it down carefully to remove air spaces, and you can leave the trees like this for a month or so if necessary, but you should definitely plant up properly before they come out of dormancy in the spring. For your container grown, you can just leave them in the containers, of course, so they'll be perfectly happy just stopping in their pots. Chosen your fruit tree, variety and size, so now you can get onto actually planting the thing. First of all, you want to think about your spot where you're going to plant the fruit tree. Most trees prefer a sunny and well-sheltered spot. So have a think about the aspect of your garden or your site, so which direction it points in, where the sun's coming from, and where it is sunniest and least shady. So whether there's any buildings blocking, making it shady, or fencing or whatever. You also should think about rain shadows. If you're planting on a balcony or in a yard, areas which receive very little rains due to fences or buildings won't be good for your tree. You just have to keep an eye on it more, so and water it more often. So best just to get that right situation for your tree in the beginning. Screening from strong winds is also important to allow for plenty of pollinators to visit your tree while it's flowering in the spring. You might want to think about the ground or the soil you're planting in. In general, fruit trees thrive best in well-drained soil with sandy, loamy texture. If there's too much clay or too many rocks, it can be difficult for a fruit tree to flourish. And soils lacking nutrients can make it challenging for fruit trees to produce tasty, juicy fruit. You are discouraged, however, from adding compost or fertilizer only to the fruit tree whole, as this will stop the tree's roots from seeking out nutrition away from the hole itself, and the tree won't establish as well. But you can improve the soil generally around the planting area in advance. I won't worry too much about the soil though, because as me and John were kind of discussing earlier, we've had a lot of success with fruit trees. So as long as your soil's not super duper stony or waterlogged or compacted, you should be okay. You might want to think about distance as well. I think a lot of people plant fruit trees a bit too close together. So this depends on your rootstock, but with that semi-vigorous or moderate growing fruit tree, you want around 4 meters between the trees. That's quite a distance. In an orchard setting, they will plant them a lot closer together, but it's good to have that space. So as you're planting the actual tree, you want to first prepare your soil, so dig the ground over in advance if you can. Loosen up the soil to make it easier for the tree to grow. Dig down at least 1 spade's depth, and dig the whole area rather than just the planting hole itself. This just allows the tree to grow a little easier, for it to spread its roots more easily. When you dig the hole, it needs to be wide enough and deep enough to accommodate the roots of the tree with limited crowding and bending of the roots. Again, break up the area around the planting hole if it's not already done. When you plant the tree, ideally beforehand, you want to soak the roots in water if it's a bare tree for a couple of hours, especially if it's been stored and allowed to dry out. You want to make sure to plant to the depth it was previously planted and with the graft above the soil line. 2 people can be really handy when planting, with one holding the tree upright and to the right level and the second refilling the hole. You want to compact the soil as you go. So add a little bit, press it down, add a little bit, press it down to remove all the air pockets. Air pockets, having those air pockets is just, it makes it more difficult for the tree to spread its roots. And don't backfill with compost, as again it stops the tree from trying to seek out any further nutrients, keeps the roots within the tree pit. And also compost can become waterlogged all winter and then dry out too quickly in the summer. It's not. I want to think about support as well. So with staking trees, dwarfing rootstocks from the smaller rootstocks do require support their whole lives, as the tree is unable to support itself. Semi-dwarfing trees and any 2-year-old tree require a temporary stake. So you might be all right if you just get a 1-year-old maiden, it can kind of establish and strengthen and grow. But if it's a larger tree in that initial period, you might want that support of a temporary stake in the first 2 or 3 years. For the permanent stake that's hit into the ground before planting the tree, it's usually a wooden post about 6 to 8 foot tall by 2 to 3 inches, sharpened at one end and treated with preservative. So that's knocked in before the tree goes in for your dwarfing rootstock, and then the tree's planted and it's tied to the permanent stake. And for the temporary stake, you want to put the stake in after the tree is planted. You can put it. I've got a diagram coming in next, so hopefully it's going to make it a bit clearer what I mean by all this kind of staking and stuff. But you either want to put it in straight, or even better, at 45-degree angle, at the height of around 1 foot above up the trunk of the tree. So if it's at this 45-degree angle, it means that the stake and the point of the stake is well away from the roots of the tree. Again, the tree should be loosely strapped to the stake so that it can move around a little bit in the wind, and this encourages the roots to strengthen, the tree to firm up. Finally, you want to think about mulching and watering. So you're probably only going to need to water if you're planting in the spring or the summer and the ground is dry. Water thoroughly, less frequently, rather than a little bit more often. That encourages the deeper roots to grow. Mulching is important year-round, though, to suppress the grass and weeds, especially within the first few years of the tree's life, to retain water and to add that kind of slow-release nutrient to the soil. Mulch could be well-rotted manure, leaf mold, compost, wood chip. So you might want to water if it is dry. If we've had a few dry days, even in the winter, you may want to water the day after the tree's been put in. But really, after the tree's settled in, you're not going to need to be so attentive, and you might just want to keep an eye on things and water in particularly dry periods. But generally, they kind of look after themselves. Here's a really good diagram, and I'll just leave this up for a second, but you can kind of see here that this is a stake that's been put in straight, so it does interfere a little bit with the roots, but that, it's an option as well if it's easier. A little bit about the mulching, about the soil prep, things like that. There are different views as to whether you should stick any organic matter or bone meal or anything like that in the hole. I wouldn't recommend it. I think the trees are generally hardy enough to kind of establish themselves, and really they need to get used to the situation they're in. I'll talk a little bit about ongoing care in a minute. So that's about fertilizing, which can be done in the spring and with fertilizer put on the surface of the soil around the tree. There's a little bit about what to do after you've planted your tree, so kind of in this first spring. You want to make sure to remove weeds from the base of the tree. And you'll probably want to continue doing this throughout the first few years as the tree becomes established. The more frequently you weed, the easier it's going to be as well. And additional mulch can be added each year to suppress the weeds and replenish any nutrients as you strip them away as well. Mulches are great to feed the soil, which in turn feeds the tree, but these should be complemented with, or can be complemented with the use of a fertilizer as well, which feeds the tree more directly. You can add an organic fertilizer in the spring. It's just most important for bare root trees, which don't come with that nutrient-rich soil as supplied with a container-grown tree. Young fruit trees need mainly nitrogen. Just get a fertilizer that's kind of an all-rounder fruit tree fertilizer. Initial pruning of the tree is important. So that's kind of pruning back some of the branches to create that balance between the crown of the tree and the roots, because it restores the, restoring that balance is really important because it may have been snapped, the roots may have been snapped or damaged during the transit of the tree. And you're just trying to create that framework for subsequent growth of the tree. It's much easier to establish the shape of the tree when it's younger than to try and remove larger branches as the tree gets older. So here's kind of a little picture here about early fruit tree planting. It's just about creating that shape and creating space for the fruit to grow and airflow through the tree. So again, there's a link here with a bit more information about this. So you'll definitely want to have a look at that if you are planting new trees. So next is a kind of a little bit about animal protection, and it shouldn't be such a problem in the city, but if you're planting in the countryside, in some fields, whatever, something like a spiral guard is really useful as a rabbit guard, as rabbits find the bark of new trees really tasty, and they can very easily damage the base of the tree, which can kill the tree. So it's worth looking into that if you're planting a bit more rural. And again, something like this on the right-hand side, a fence for deer, which I don't know where you're planting, but maybe a problem as well. And we use these guards in public places, often just to make sure that people don't walk over the trees if they're smaller, to make a bit of a statement, and also to stop people from snapping the branches and things like that. You want to make sure that you take off the spiral guard after a couple of years, though, as they can harbour damp and pests. So don't leave that on the whole life of the tree. So here's our sort of final bit in the presentation. I see that time's going on, and I knew I'd be a little bit tight with the timing, actually, because there's so much to talk about. But just very quickly, following on from the first couple of years, as the tree becomes more established, you won't need to attend to them so much, but most trees benefit from pruning every couple of years or when damaged. You should look out for any signs of disease as well, and feeding can help boost the crop of an underproductive tree. So I'll go a little bit through each of these. First of all, a little bit about pruning. Best time to prune apple and pear trees is in the late winter or very early spring, before any new growth starts. The tree is dormant, as we mentioned, in that period, after shedding its leaves and before sprouting new buds. And I recommend pruning, if you can, in the spring rather than the winter, as the cuts heal much more quickly and they're not open and unprotected for such a long time until they begin to grow again. Stone fruit, like plums and cherries, should be pruned in the early to mid-summer, because they those open wounds can attract silverleaf, which is a nasty disease, or bacterial canker. So the first job is to prune the 3Ds, dead, damaged, and diseased. So look out for those branches. And the second is to kind of think about pruning to create a more open structure in the tree, to encourage sunlight to the fruit, to get them to ripen better, and also to make sure there's good airflow around the tree, so there's no damp and mold within the tree. Understanding your tree makes a big difference in how you prune it. One of the most important lessons is what the buds look like. So a growth bud is a bud that produces a branch but no fruit, while a flowering bud produces a flower which matures to become an apple. So in this picture here, the one on the left is a growth bud and the one on the right is a fruiting bud. So it's worth looking out for them when you're pruning so you don't end up pruning all your fruiting buds off. Next, just talk very quickly about pests and diseases. Trees are able to fight with disease, so first and foremost is keeping the trees healthy by mulching, feeding and checking for damage where disease could enter the tree and keeping that open structure to allow airflow. Some disease can be cut off by removing branches and cutting areas of the trunk away, but you should always make sure to clean your tools and dispose of any diseased material, just get it off site. Often fruit is still edible if it's affected by pests or diseases, but it's worth checking up, having a look online at some of these ID kind of disease guides, which I'll give you a link to in a bit. A few common problems. So we've got apple scab. It's a fungal infection. And the idea with that is to remove diseased fruits and any breaking down material underneath the tree to reduce the amount of fungus around and able to attach to the tree. The second one here is canker. That's very common and it's actually not such a big deal if it can be cut away and disposed of. And this one here is a pest, so it's an apple that's been affected by codling moth, and these are adult moths which lay their eggs inside the developing fruit in May and June. You can destroy this fruit and the branches, the fruit, sorry, and make sure everything's very clean and things. And I think pheromone traps I've read as well can help to capture adult moths in the spring. So there's a few problems there and a few kind of solutions. Loads more information online, and you know, just I'm no expert on fruit tree pests and diseases, so apart from having removed a few branches or cut out a bit of canker before, but there's so much information online. And you might also want to check if your tree has a nutrient deficiency and it's not some kind of disease. So there's a great link here for that kind of thing. So it's what to look out for in leaves and fruits and branches and things for that nutrient deficiency. And again, that would just be feeding with fertilizer to replace any missing nutrients. And then finally, just a little bit about under or unproductive trees. Have a tree that's not producing or doesn't produce every year or is underproducing. You just want to check a few things, check you've got your pollination requirements right so that you have that pollination partner. That might evidence of that might be a flower but no fruit or an underdeveloped fruit. And you also been having kind of swinging back and forth seasons recently. So a warm period followed by a cold period, which could kind of trick the tree into growing those flowers early on, which they can then be damaged by frost, which of course affects the fruit further on. So there's ways to protect smaller trees in those situations. Just make sure that the area around your tree is clear so that it has the best chance of being watered, you know, of attracting the rain and getting as many nutrients as possible to keep the tree healthy, happy. As I mentioned before, over pruning, so removing all those fruit buds, will mean that you will have no fruit. Certain pests and diseases can limit fruiting. And yeah, just again, it's worth looking just into all these amazing guides and resources online for any specific problems or advice about planting or about your trees that you already have. And I think that's about it. Thank you for listening. I hope this hasn't been too much of a kind of a jabbery kind of whirlwind of a presentation. I'd really suggest calling any of these online suppliers if you need any specific advice, what to plant where. We'll go through any questions now. I realise I'm almost up to 11 o'clock, so Not very long left. How much time we'll have for questions, but oh, it's okay. We've not so many anyway. Alia was asking if it's possible to grow a small tree in a container. Yeah, definitely is. You can get these dwarfing rootstocks. The fruit should, I mean, obviously the tree won't end up as big, you won't get as much fruit, but you will still get lovely fruit and decent sized fruit. So it's worth just looking through those catalogues online. But to get something more specific like that, like a patio fruit tree or a small pot grown fruit tree, definitely those online suppliers are worth going to because they have such a wide variety of trees grown in different rootstocks and trained in different ways. So yeah, definitely an option. Any tips? Danielle says, any tips for protecting from birds and squirrels without netting the whole tree? I don't know. I think one of the things is if you something like cherries are a bit tricky to grow because the birds can be there one day and just about ripe, and the next day you go back and they're all gone. So in that case, you'd need to net if you wanted to grow cherries. I think that anything else, though, you can maybe share a little bit with the birds and the squirrels, because they just keep an eye on when things are ripening. Any books? I don't think I really have any books. Almost some RHS books out there on fruit tree growing, but there's just so many guides online. I definitely just recommend having a look through a few of them. That's about it. Yeah. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that was useful. It's a bit of a kind of whirlwind introduction, and I think this is our last in this block of webinars. So please keep an eye on our social media. We tend to put everything up there about new webinars and things like that, Facebook and Twitter. Our plan is to run some more, obviously because of current circumstances, we're not able to get out as much as we'd like with different groups. So it's a great way to still meet people, and pass on a little bit of knowledge. And we've got this great database now of dozens of presentations online. So win-win, really. Yep. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And thanks very much. And I hope you have a lovely weekend. Hope to see you all soon.